You want to know the truth about that night? Fine, I'll tell you, but I need you to understand something first. I was there. I'm not somebody who read about it in the papers and now pretends he knows. I was in the room. I had my hand on that door when it came off the frame. In almost 20 years of service, I never saw anything like what we found behind it. Let me start at the beginning, otherwise none of it makes sense. My name doesn't matter much. People who served with me called me Hale, Sergeant Daniel Hale, 2nd Company of the Sable Guard in the Kingdom of Aldermere. 19 years I gave to that uniform. The black tunic, the silver collar, the tall cap that makes your neck ache after the 3rd hour. You've seen us in photographs, probably. Standing outside Ashbourne Palace in the capital, Marlow, still as statues while the tourists do everything they can to make us blink. That was my world. Stand still, say nothing, protect the family, disappear into the wall. I was good at it, the disappearing part especially. So when I tell you that on the night of the 11th of November, 3 winters ago, a whole unit of us moved fast, moved loud, moved with weapons drawn through a quiet street where ordinary people were sleeping, you should understand how strange that was. The Sable Guard doesn't move like that. We're ceremonial mostly. We look frightening and we hold doors and we faint sometimes in summer because nobody's allowed to loosen a collar in front of a king. But that night we weren't ceremonial. That night somebody upstairs decided that Julian Vane's apartment had to be entered, and entered now, and they sent us to do it. Julian Vane. You'd know the name if you followed any of it. The Queen Consort's son, not the King's son, her son from before. Eleanora Vane married into the crown when Julian was already a grown man, near 40, with his own life and his own flat across the river in the Hartwell district. He never wanted the spotlight. That was always the thing people said about him. Julian keeps to himself. Julian doesn't come to the galas. Julian's the quiet one. Turns out the quiet ones are the ones you have to watch. Let me set the night for you, because the night matters. It was cold. Not pretty cold, not the kind that frosts the windows and makes everything look like a postcard. It was the wet kind. The kind that gets into the seams of your boots and stays there. There'd been rain all afternoon, and the streets of Hartwell were black and shining under the lamps, and you could hear the river off to the east, that low, constant breathing sound a big river makes when nobody's around to talk over it. We'd been pulled off our normal posts at 9:30. That alone had everyone whispering. You don't pull ceremonial guards in the middle of a shift unless something's gone wrong. I remember Corporal Briggs leaning over to me in the back of the transport, his face half lit by the little orange running lights, and saying, "Hale, you ever been on one of these before?" One of what? An entry, a real one. I told him no. I'd done crowd control. I'd stood between the family and angry men more than once, but never this, never breaking into somebody's home in the dark. He nodded slow and went quiet, and I watched his hands. He kept opening and closing them. That's a thing nervous men do without knowing it. I didn't say anything about it. I had my own hands to worry about. There were 8 of us in the back of that vehicle, plus the lieutenant up front, a hard, narrow man named Pell who'd come over from the army proper and never let us forget it. Pell hadn't told us much. He'd told us almost nothing, actually, and that was its own kind of warning. When the brass tells you everything, it's routine. When they tell you nothing, it's because the truth is too big to fit in a briefing. All Pell said was this: "We have credible intelligence that the residence of Julian Vane contains material that poses a direct threat to the crown. We enter, we secure, we hold. No press, no phones. Anyone who talks about tonight talks to a tribunal. Understood?" We all said understood. I didn't understand a single thing, but I said it. Here's a small detail I never forgot, and I think about it more than I should. When we turned onto Julian Street, Calder Row, it was a nice quiet street of old converted townhouses. There was a cat, just a cat, sitting on a low garden wall, watching us with that flat, unbothered look cats have. And I remember thinking, of all the stupid things to think, that cat has no idea anything is happening. The whole world was about to tip over and the cat was just sitting there licking its paw. I held onto that cat in my mind through the whole thing that followed. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the last normal thing I saw. We parked 2 doors down, lights off. Pell gave the signal and we came out of the back of that vehicle quiet as we could, which for 8 men in heavy boots is not very quiet at all. The rain had stopped, but everything still dripped. I could hear my own breath. I could hear Briggs's breath, faster than mine. Julian's flat was on the 3rd floor of a tall, narrow building, the kind with a green front door and a brass knocker shaped like a fox. There was a light on up there. 3rd floor, 2 windows, warm yellow light behind thin curtains. Somebody was home and awake. That changed things in my head. Up until then it had been abstract. A residence, material, a threat. But now there was a light on, which meant a person, which meant Julian Vane himself was up there, probably reading or eating something late or watching the little television I'd later see in the corner of his front room. And he had no idea that 8 armed men were standing in the dark below his window deciding how to come through his door. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for him. Hold your judgment. By the end of this you won't know who to feel sorry for. That's the honest truth of it. I still don't. We went in through the front. Pell didn't want a quiet approach anymore once we saw the light. He wanted speed. The reasoning, he told us later, was that if Julian was awake and there really was dangerous material in the flat, every second we gave him was a second he could use to destroy it, or worse, use it. So the order changed from quiet to fast. The green door wasn't built for men like us. Briggs and a big quiet lad named Osai put their shoulders into it, and the lock tore right out of the old wood on the second hit. The sound of it in that silent street was enormous. Somewhere a dog started barking. A window across the road lit up. I remember thinking, the whole neighborhood is going to remember this, and I was right. They did. Then we were inside, in a narrow hall that smelled of old carpet and somebody's dinner, and we were going up. Boots on wooden stairs. The building shaking a little with all of us at once. Pell in front, then Osai, then me, then the rest strung out behind. And the whole way up those 3 flights I kept waiting to feel something. Fear, I suppose, or the cold, clean focus they train into you. But what I actually felt was wrong. Just wrong all the way through. Like I'd swallowed something that wouldn't go down, because this was a man's home, a son's home, and we were thundering up his stairs in the dark like the building was on fire. We reached his door, 3rd floor, number 9, a little brass 9 slightly crooked on its nail. Pell raised his fist for us to stop. We stopped, and in that 1 second of stillness, with all of us packed onto that little landing breathing like horses, I heard something through the door that I'll never forget. Music, soft music. Some old slow song with a woman singing, the kind your grandmother might have liked. And under it, faint, a man's voice humming along. Just humming. Off-key and happy and completely, totally unaware. Julian Vane was in there humming to himself. And then we took his door off its hinges. I want to slow down here, because what happened in the next 10 seconds happened very fast in real life, and I've spent 3 years trying to remember it slow. The door went in. The music kept playing for a half-second longer before it registered, before the man in the room understood that his world had just changed. We came through into a warm front room with low lamps and books everywhere. I mean everywhere, stacked on the floor, the chairs, the windowsills, and a small fire going in a little iron grate, and a half-empty cup of tea on a side table, still steaming. And there in the middle of it, frozen, standing by an old record player with his hand still half-raised toward it, was Julian Vane. He was not what I expected. I'd built a picture of him on the way over, the way you do. Some hard, secretive man with cold eyes. A threat to the crown, they'd said. So I'd imagined a threat. What I got instead was a soft-faced man in his early 50s, going gray, wearing a cardigan with a hole in one elbow and slippers, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead. He looked, more than anything, startled. The way anyone looks when their door explodes inward at 11 at night. He didn't go for a weapon. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just put both his hands up slow, palms out, and said, and I remember this exactly, he said, "Please don't break the books. Whatever this is, please don't break the books." That was the first thing the Queen's son said to us. Not who are you, or what do you want, or do you know who I am. He was worried about the books. Pell shouted the usual. Down on the ground, hands behind your head, nobody moves. Julian went down onto his knees on his own carpet, slow and careful, an aging man being careful with his knees, and he laced his fingers behind his head, and he kept his eyes down, and the only thing he said after that, very quietly, almost to himself, was, "She told me this might happen one day." She, the Queen, his mother. Nobody else seemed to catch it in the noise, but I was 3 feet from him. I caught it, and it lodged in my chest like a splinter because in the middle of all this, the threat, the intelligence, the tribunal warnings that didn't sound like a guilty man caught out. It sounded like a man who'd been waiting. We secured the front room first. That's procedure. You don't go deeper until the space you're in is locked down. 2 men on Julian, 2 men on the windows, the rest of us moving room to room. It was a small flat. A front room full of books, a little kitchen with 1 plate drying by the sink, a bathroom, a bedroom with an unmade bed and more books, and a study at the back. It was the study where things started to go wrong. Or right, I genuinely don't know which word to use even now. The study door was locked. Not just shut, locked with a proper lock, the kind you'd put on a strong room, not a writing room. That stopped Pell cold. Everything else in the flat was open and soft and lived in. A man who leaves his tea steaming and his books on the floor doesn't put a vault lock on his study door for no reason. Pell went back to Julian, crouched down in front of him, and asked him very calmly for the key. And Julian Vane, kneeling on his own carpet with 8 men in his home, looked up at the lieutenant and said something that changed the temperature of the whole night. He said, "If you open that room, you can't unknow what's inside. None of you can. Are you sure your orders cover that?" Now, I've replayed that sentence more times than I can count, because it wasn't a threat. He wasn't trying to frighten us. There was something almost kind in how he said it, the way you'd warn a child away from a hot stove. He was, I swear to you, trying to protect us from whatever was behind that door. Pell didn't blink. Pell never blinked. He just held out his hand and said, "The key." Julian closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said it was in the drawer of the side table, under the tea, taped to the underside. We found it exactly where he said. A small brass key, old, taped to the bottom of the drawer with yellowing tape. And I remember Briggs handing it to Pell, and Pell holding it up to the lamplight and turning it once, and the whole room going quiet again, even the men, even the breathing, because somehow all of us understood at the same moment that whatever this whole night had been for was on the other side of that locked door. Pell looked at me. Of all of them, he looked at me. I never knew why. Maybe because I was nearest. Maybe because I had the steadiest hands that night, which was a joke, because inside I was anything but. "Hail," he said, "with me." I'm going to stop part 1 here, because what was behind that door deserves to be told properly and not rushed, and because my hands are shaking a little even writing it now, 3 years on, in a warm room with the door wide open and no orders and no tribunal. But I'll leave you with this, so you know it's worth coming back for. When that lock turned and the study door swung open, the first thing I saw was not a weapon. It was not a bomb. It was not any of the dark things they'd put in our heads on the drive over. The first thing I saw was the Queen's face. Hundreds of them. And every single one of them was watching me. I told you the first thing I saw was the Queen's face. Hundreds of them, and everyone watching me. Let me tell you what that actually meant, because in the moment my mind couldn't make sense of it, and I need you to feel that same confusion I felt, standing in that doorway with the brass key still warm in Pell's hand. The study was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. One window, blacked out with a sheet of dark cloth pinned over it so no light got in or out. And every wall, every single wall, floor to ceiling, was covered in photographs of Queen Eleanor Vane. Not glamour shots, not the official portraits you'd buy on a postcard outside Hollowcrest Palace. These were candid, real, the Queen getting out of cars, the Queen at a window, the Queen in a garden I didn't recognize, much older in some, much younger in others. Some of them looked decades old, faded and yellow at the edges. Some looked like they'd been printed last week. And taped between them, threaded across the whole mess with thin red cord pinned at the corners, were papers, letters, newspaper clippings gone soft with handling, lists in a tight, careful handwriting, dates, so many dates. My first thought, God forgive me, but it's the truth, my first thought was that we'd found exactly what they said we'd find, a threat. Because what kind of son builds a shrine to his own mother in a locked room with the windows blacked out? My stomach turned over. I thought they were right about him. He's not well. He's dangerous. That's what they wanted me to think. I understand that now. But standing there in that first ugly second, it worked on me just like it was supposed to. Then I started reading. Pell moved into the room first. I followed. The others held the doorway. Pell didn't want 8 men trampling whatever this was before we understood it. Just him and me, and behind us, very far away it felt like, the soft sound of that record still turning in the front room, the needle hissing at the end of the song, around and around in the dead groove. Pell stood in the middle of that little room turning slowly, taking it in, and I watched his face do something I'd never seen it do in 2 years of serving under the man. I watched it lose its certainty. "Hale," he said quietly, "read me one out loud, whatever's nearest." The nearest paper to me was a letter, pinned at eye height, written in a looping old-fashioned hand. The ink was blue. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times it was going to lint along the creases. I read it. I'm not going to give you every word, because some of it I've forgotten and some of it I'd rather not say even now, but the shape of it was this. It was a letter from the Queen, from Eleanor herself. I'd swear my life on that handwriting. I'd seen it on 100 official documents, to her son. And it was dated 3 years before that night. And in it she told him she was frightened. She told him she was being moved. That was the word she used, moved. That she was being kept from people she trusted. That letters she sent weren't arriving and replies she should have gotten never came. That she'd started writing things down, small things, the dates of meetings she wasn't allowed to attend, the names of staff who'd been let go without explanation and replaced with faces she didn't know. She said she didn't want to sound like a foolish old woman. She said, "Please don't think I've lost my reason, Julian." She said it twice in the one letter. "Please don't think I've lost my reason." And then, at the bottom, she wrote a line I will carry to my grave. She wrote, "If anything ever happens to me, it will not have been my heart. Keep what I send you. Keep all of it. You may be the only one who believes me." I stopped reading. The room was very quiet. Even the record had stopped hissing. Somebody in the front room had finally lifted the needle. Pell said, "Read me the date again." I read him the date. He looked at the wall of photographs, all those years of the Queen's face, and I saw him understand at the same moment I did. It wasn't a shrine. It was a file. Julian Vane hadn't been watching his mother out of madness. He'd been documenting her, building a record. Year after year, photograph after photograph, letter after letter, because a frightened woman had asked her quiet son to keep what she sent him in case the day came when nobody else would believe her. And here we were, 8 armed men of the Sable Guard who had broken his door down in the dark, sent to seize and destroy the one record that proved she'd been telling the truth. We were the day she'd been afraid of. We were it. I need to back up and tell you about Julian himself, because while Pell and I were in that study, the rest of it was still happening in the front room, and it matters. Two of our men, Briggs and a younger lad named Teal, had Julian on his knees the whole time. And Julian, to his enormous credit, hadn't said another word after the thing about his mother. He just knelt there on his own carpet, an aging man with a hole in his cardigan, and waited. But Teal told me afterward, over a drink much later, when both of us had left the regiment, that the whole time we were in that study, Julian's lips were moving, silently. And Teal, who was bored and frightened and looking for anything to focus on, leaned in to try and hear what he was saying. He was counting. Julian Vane was counting under his breath, slow and even, and when Teal asked him, just whispered, "What are you counting?" Julian stopped and looked up at him and said, just as quiet, "How long it takes them to decide whether I'm a criminal or a witness. It tells you a great deal about a man, how long that takes him." Teal never forgot it. Neither did I when he told me, because the honest answer is it took Pell about 90 seconds, and it took me about 60, and there were men in that flat for whom it never quite finished taking, men who, to this day, will tell you Julian Vane was a disturbed individual, and the rest is just a story he was clever enough to dress up. People believe what's easiest to carry. I learned that the hard way 3 years ago in that little flat on Calder Row. Here's where it tightened. Here's where the night stopped being strange and started being dangerous, and I don't mean dangerous to us. I mean dangerous in a way none of us had clearance to even look at. In the corner of the study, under a pile of those red-corded papers, there was a box, metal, gray, about the size of a large biscuit tin but heavier, the kind of thing meant to survive a fire. It was locked too, but the lock was simple, and Pell had it open in under a minute with the little tool from his kit. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a stack of letters, more of them, all in the Queen's hand, bound with a ribbon, years of them. The second was a single old photograph, much older than the rest, of a young woman holding a baby. I didn't understand it at the time. I'd understand it later. We all would. The whole kingdom would. And the third was a small black recorder, the kind people used to use for dictation, with a single tape already loaded. Pell looked at that recorder for a long time. Then he did something against every order we'd been given. We'd been told, secure, hold, touch nothing, wait for the recovery team. A second unit was coming, a recovery team, Pell had called it on the drive, men whose job was to take whatever we found and make it disappear, no records, no inventory. We were just supposed to break the door and hold the room until they arrived to carry it all away into the dark. Pell pressed play, and the Queen's voice filled that little blacked-out room. I won't pretend I remember the recording word for word. I was too stunned, but I remember the sound of it. It was her, older than in the official broadcasts, tired, her voice catching now and then like she was speaking quickly and quietly and afraid of being heard. She talked about being kept from the king. She said the two of them were rarely allowed in a room alone anymore, that there was always someone there, always one of the new staff, and that messages she gave for him she had reason to think never reached him. She named a man. I'm not going to put his name in this. Even now, even fictional names carry weight. But she named a senior figure in the household, a man whose whole career was built on managing the family's image, and she said she believed he had decided she was a liability, that she made the crown look weak, that there were people who'd been quietly building a case that she was unwell, unstable, that her reason was going, so that when the time came, they could move her somewhere quiet and explain it all very kindly to the public. And then, near the end, she said the thing that I think about most. She said, "I am not unwell. I want that on something that cannot be edited. I am old and I am tired and I am frightened of the people who are supposed to keep me safe. But I am not unwell. Julian, if they ever come for what you're keeping, and they will, my darling, one day they will, then you'll know it's because I was right." Click, the tape ran out. And in the silence after it, Lieutenant Pell, A hard, narrow army man who'd never in 2 years let me see anything behind his eyes turned to me, and I saw that his jaw was working, and his hands, his steady hands, were not steady anymore. "Hale," he said, "we weren't sent here to stop a threat." "No, sir," I said, "I don't think we were. We were sent here to be the threat. We're the thing she warned him about." He looked at the box. He looked at the wall of his queen's face. "We are the men who came for it." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. We just stood there, two soldiers of the Sable Guard in a dead woman's son's study. And yes, I said dead, and I'll get to that. Hold on, realizing that the uniform we'd given our lives to had been pointed at the very family it existed to protect, and we'd carried it here ourselves, on our own shoulders, up 3 flights of stairs in the rain. Now dead, I owe you that because I've let it slip and I won't take it back. What none of us in that flat knew yet, what Julian knew, kneeling silent in the front room, counting, was that Queen Eleanor Vane had died 11 days earlier. Officially, it was her heart, a quiet passing in the night at one of the country estates. The kingdom had already mourned her. There'd been a service, black-bordered front pages, the king at the graveside with his head bowed. I'd stood in that funeral cordon myself, 10 days before, holding back a crowd of weeping strangers, never once imagining that within 2 weeks I'd be standing in her son's blacked-out study listening to her tell me, from a cheap tape, "If anything ever happens to me, it will not have been my heart." That's why the raid happened when it happened. That's the piece that took me longest to put together, and once I did, I couldn't put it back. She died, and someone, somewhere up in the high, quiet rooms of the household, knew exactly what she'd left behind, and exactly who she'd left it with, and knew that a grieving son in possession of his mother's secret record was the single most dangerous thing in the kingdom. A man with nothing left to lose and a box full of a dead queen's own voice. So they moved, fast. 11 days, just long enough for the funeral to settle the public's grief, just long enough that any noise out of Julian Vane afterward could be waved away as a broken man unable to accept his mother's death. Poor Julian took it terribly hard, started saying the strangest things. We did try to help him. They had the whole story ready. All they needed was for us to walk in and carry out the proof. And we very nearly did. Here is the moment it all came to its edge. I've told it slow up to now. This part I'll tell you the way it happened, which was fast and ugly and over almost before it began. Pell's radio crackled. It was the recovery team. They were 2 minutes out. A voice I didn't recognize, flat, calm, the calmest voice I heard the entire night, which was its own kind of horror, asked for a status. Asked, specifically, had we located the materials and were they intact? And Pell and I watched him do this. I watched the exact second the man chose. Pell keyed the radio and said, "Negative. Residents searched. No materials present. Resident is cooperative. Recommend stand down." A lie. A flat, deliberate lie into a radio to the people who'd sent us. The calm voice paused, then it said, "Lieutenant, confirm no materials." And Pell, looking right at the gray metal box, right at the wall of his dead queen's watching face, said, "Confirmed. No materials, nothing here." He let go of the radio. His hand was shaking so hard the box rattled when he set it down. And he looked at me and said, very low, so the men in the doorway couldn't hear, "Hale, in about 2 minutes, men are going to come up those stairs who are very good at making things disappear. And right now the most dangerous object in this kingdom is sitting in this room. And so are we. And so is that man out there who hasn't lost his mother and his mind, only his mother, and is about to lose a great deal more if we don't." And that's when Julian Vane spoke from the doorway. None of us had heard him get up. Briggs swore later he never took his hands off him, but somehow there he was, standing in the doorway of his own study in his slippers and his cardigan with the hole in the elbow, looking at the wall of his mother, and at the open box, and at the two of us standing over it. And he said, very gently, like he was the one comforting us. You played the tape. It wasn't a question. Then you know, and now you have to decide what kind of men you are. The same decision I had to make 11 days ago when she died, and I knew, and I had to choose between staying quiet and staying alive, or telling the truth and becoming exactly the madman they'd already decided I was. He almost smiled. It was the saddest thing I ever saw. I chose quiet. I'm ashamed of it. I've been ashamed of it for 11 days. He looked at the box. You've just been braver than her own son was. And down on the street through the blacked-out window, I heard the second vehicle pull up, doors opening. The recovery team, calm men, good at making things disappear. 2 minutes, Pell had said. We were out of minutes. 2 minutes, Pell had said. We were already out of them. I could hear boots in the stairwell below, not many, 3 or 4 men, but moving up calm and unhurried, and somehow the calm of it was worse than if they'd come running. Running men are afraid. These men weren't afraid of anything. They'd done this before. I want to tell you that what happened next was a plan. A clever, brave plan that we worked out in the seconds we had. It wasn't. It was 3 frightened men and a gray metal box, and almost no time, and a decision made mostly with the hands before the head could catch up. Pell shoved the box at me. Bottom of your tunic, now. I didn't argue. I'd carried a lot of things under that black tunic over 19 years. Never a thing that mattered, not once, until that night. The box was heavy and the corners dug into my ribs, and I crossed my arms over it the way you do when you're cold. And I prayed nobody would look too hard at a guardsman standing with his arms folded looking sick, because that's exactly what I was. Then Pell did the second thing. He went out onto the landing, and he met those men at the top of the stairs, and he became, in front of my eyes, the most convincing liar I have ever watched work. There were 4 of them, no uniforms, dark coats, dark gloves, the kind of men you'd never look at twice and never remember if you did. The one in front had that flat, calm voice I'd heard on the radio. He asked Pell, very politely, to step aside so his team could conduct a secondary sweep. And Pell laughed. Tired, irritated, a soldier at the end of a long, pointless night. He said the place had been turned over twice. There was nothing here but a sad man and 1,000 books, that someone's intelligence had been rubbish, that he'd be putting it in his report, and that if the recovery team wanted to waste another hour pulling apart a flat full of paperbacks, they were welcome to it, but he was taking his men home. It was perfect. It was exactly what an annoyed, empty-handed officer sounds like, and the calm man almost bought it. Almost. But his eyes went past Pell, into the study, to the wall. To the wall of the Queen's face. And I watched him see it. I watched him understand that whatever Julian Vane had built in that room, intelligence had not been rubbish at all, that there had been something here worth all of this, and his calm slipped. Just for half a second, just enough that I saw the thing underneath it, which was not calm at all. It was hunger. "Lieutenant," he said softly, "where is the box?" Not a box, the box. He knew exactly what he'd come for, he'd always known. Here's the part where it could have gone very badly, and where Julian Vane stopped being a quiet man counting under his breath and became, for about 30 seconds, the bravest person in that building. He stepped between Pell and the calm man, an aging son in slippers, in front of professionals. And he said, loud enough that it carried down the stairwell, loud enough that the neighbors I told you about, the ones whose windows had lit up, would later swear in their own statements that they heard a man shouting on the 3rd floor of 9 Calder Row. He said, "My mother left a recording of her own voice. She made it because she knew you'd come. She is on a tape, in her own words, nomming the man who decided she was inconvenient and built a case that she was mad so he could put her away quietly and never have it touch the crown. She died 11 days ago of a heart, they tell me. A heart. And here you are, 11 days. So, you can take whatever you find in this flat. But 3 soldiers of the Sable Guard have now heard her voice, and you cannot make them disappear, and you cannot make the neighbors unhear me. and I am going to keep saying her name and his name on these stairs until somebody who is not on your payroll comes and writes it down." And he started shouting the name. The household man's name. The one I won't write even now. He stood in his slippers in his ruined doorway and he shouted that name down the stairwell of his building, again and again, his voice cracking, and lights came on all up and down Calder Row, and somewhere a window scraped open, and a woman called out, "Should I phone someone? Is somebody hurt up there?" And that ordinary voice from an ordinary window was the thing that broke it. Because the calm man's whole power was quiet. Quiet rooms, quiet disappearances, a story already written. The one thing he could not survive was witnesses and noise, and Julian had just handed him a streetful of both. I watched the calm man do the math. I watched him understand that the moment had already escaped him, that there were now too many ears, too many windows, a shouting man and 3 guardsmen and a whole street of woken neighbors, and that whatever he did next would be done in front of all of them. And men like him do not act in front of witnesses. That's the entire point of men like him. He looked at Pell for a long moment. He looked at Julian, still shouting. He looked last of all at me, at the guardsman standing with his arms folded across his chest looking sick, and I have never in my life worked so hard to keep my face empty. I don't know if he knew. I think part of him knew. I think he looked at me and understood that the box was under my tunic and that it didn't matter anymore because the secret it held had already left the room. It was out there in the night air, in a sun's cracking voice, in a dozen lit windows. He turned around. He and his 3 quiet men went back down the stairs. No box, no threat, nothing, just gone the way they'd come. And the 4 of us, Pell and Julian, and Teal and Briggs, who'd come out onto the landing with their mouths open, stood there in the wreck of that doorway listening to the second vehicle pull away into the dark. And nobody said a single word, until Julian Vane sat down. Just sat down, right there on the top stair, and put his face in his hands, and made a sound I'd only ever heard once before, at a graveside, 10 days earlier, from a stranger in a crowd I was paid to hold back. He cried like a man who'd been holding his breath for 11 days, and was only now allowed to let it out. You want to know what was on the tape that mattered most? What broke the thing open in the weeks that followed? I'll tell you, but I'll tell you carefully, because this is the part that became the scandal, the part that filled the papers, the part people argue about to this day. It was the old photograph, the one in the box I told you I didn't understand, a young woman holding a baby. The young woman was Eleonora, long before any of it, before the marriage that made her a queen, before Julian was even grown, when she was barely more than a girl herself. And the baby was not Julian. That's all I'll say about whose it was, because it isn't mine to say, and because the family that grew from that baby is real and quiet and never asked to be part of any of this. But understand what it meant. It meant that long before she was ever near a crown, Eleonora had given up a child, and that the household, the calm men, the man whose name Julian shouted down the stairs, had found out, and had held it, for years, as a leash. Behave, be small, be grateful. Or the kingdom learns what you did when you were 19 and frightened and alone. That was the real story. The madness, the being moved, the messages that never arrived, the case quietly built that she was losing her reason. All of it was the household tightening a leash that had been around her neck since before she was queen. And when she got too old and too tired and too honest to be controlled by it anymore. When she started writing things down and sending them to her son, they decided the kindest thing for everyone was for her to slip quietly away of a heart. She'd left the photograph in the box on purpose, right beside the tape, so that nobody could pretend the recording was the ravings of a confused old woman. Here is the thing they used against me. Here is the truth in my own hand. Now you have both. Now you decide. She was, I have come to believe, the cleverest person in that entire palace, and they spent 30 years convincing the world she was the foolish one. It came out, not all at once and not cleanly. These things never come out cleanly. but it came out. Julian Vane took his mother's box, and the neighbors gave their statements about the shouting on the stairs, and 3 soldiers of the Sable Guard did a thing soldiers are not supposed to do, which is tell the truth about an order. Pell went first. He sat in front of an inquiry and he described that night exactly as it happened, the radio, the lie, the box, all of it, and he ended his testimony. I was in the room. I heard him by saying that he had taken an oath to protect the family, and that on the night of the 11th of November he had finally understood that the oath and his orders were not the same thing, and that when they came apart in his hands he had chosen the oath. They couldn't really punish him for that. They wanted to, they couldn't. The whole country was watching by then. The household man, the calm voice, the name on the stairs, was never charged with anything. I want to be honest with you about that, because the stories people tell each other always end with the villain in chains, and the truth doesn't always do that. He was never charged. He retired. He gave a statement full of words like misunderstanding and a difficult period and the late Queen's declining health, and he kept his house and his pension and his quiet. But everyone knew. That was the thing. After that night, everyone knew. And for a man whose entire power was built on quiet, on being the unseen hand, on managing what the kingdom was allowed to believe, being known was its own kind of ending. He lives somewhere now where people look at him in the street. I'm told he doesn't go out much. Julian Vane is alive and well, by the way. Still in a flat full of books, though not that one he moved, understandably. He gives a little money to a small charity for elderly people who have nobody to advocate for them, people who get called confused when they're only old and inconvenient and right. He never sought the spotlight after, the same as before. The quiet one. He just wanted, I think, for his mother to have been believed, and in the end she was. As for me, I left the Sable Guard the following spring. 19 years, and I handed back the black tunic and the silver collar and the cap that aches your neck, and I walked out of Hollowcrest Palace for the last time on an ordinary gray morning, and nobody stopped me, and nobody noticed, which is the whole art of being a guard, disappearing into the wall. People ask me when they find out why I left. They expect a bitter answer. They expect me to say I lost my faith in the crown, or that I couldn't stand under that arch any more knowing what I knew. It's not that. The crown didn't fail Eleanor Vane. People did. Quiet, careful, frightened people who decided that an old woman's truth was more dangerous than her silence. The uniform was never the problem. The uniform is just cloth. It does whatever the man inside it decides to do, and that night, by the grace of God and a son shouting on a stairwell, the men inside it decided right. I left because of the cat. I told you about the cat at the very start. On the wall when we turned onto Calder Row. Just sitting there, washing its paw, with no idea that 8 men were about to break a door and a kingdom was about to tip over. I think about that cat all the time. Because for 19 years that was me. Standing on my wall, washing my paw, no idea what I was a part of. Doing my duty, keeping my head empty, disappearing into the stone. And it took a frightened old queen, who I never once met and only ever heard on a cheap tape in a blacked-out room, to teach me, far too late, that there is no such thing as just standing your post. That the wall you disappear into is built of choices, and one night they will hand you the box, and you will find out what kind of man has been wearing your uniform all along. She was not unwell. She wanted that on something that could not be edited. So here it is, in my own words, on the record. She was not unwell. She was right. And the people who were paid to keep her safe were the ones she had to be saved from, and in the end, it wasn't a king or a court or a crown that saved her name. It was a locked door, a son who finally stopped being quiet, and 3 tired men who heard a dead woman's voice and decided, just in time, to believe her.